Oh, bless your little heart, Alara. Do you genuinely think that dilapidated little bungalow is some kind of family legacy? It's a financial liability that you, bless your heart, can barely keep standing. We're doing you a favor by taking it. Honestly, you should be thanking us. The cruel saccharine voice of Veronica, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law Celeste's mother, dripped with condescension, cutting through the silence of the mahogany-paneled dining room. I sat there small and apologetic, clutching the worn strap of my old handbag like a life raft. My cheap polyester dress felt scratchy against the velvet seat of the imported chair, and my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining the facade. I looked up at Veronica, whose face was perfectly sculpted by a lifetime of entitlement and expensive procedures. She leaned back, basking in her perceived victory, her diamond bracelet catching the afternoon light. Her daughter Celeste, the one who was supposed to marry my son, Elijah, offered a practiced, empty smile. Mom is right, Alara. It's too much stress for you. Once the marriage is settled and the property is legally transferred, as a gift to us of course, you'll be free of all that worry. Think of it as your wedding contribution. They didn't see the flicker in my eyes. They didn't see past the faded floral print of my dress or the slight quiver in my voice when I asked meekly if I could just keep the small garden shed. They saw only the weak link, the poor, grieving and naive widow who had stumbled into their world of calculated affluence, carrying a forgotten piece of prime real estate they were desperate to steal. I let my head bow in what they assumed was quiet defeat, letting the silence hang heavy with their victory. I took a deep breath and smiled because there was something my dear daughter-in-law's family didn't know. My journey to this opulent, soul-crushing dining room, and my decision to present myself as a harmless poor fool, began 7 months earlier, on the day I realized my life, and the future of my son, was entirely exposed. It began with the deep sickening void left by the man who had protected our secret for 20 years. My husband, Daniel. My Daniel. He was the only person who knew the full scope of our life's work. When he had his massive, sudden stroke 7 months ago, it wasn't just my heart that shattered. It was the entire foundation of the highly complex financial fortress we had spent 2 decades building. We didn't just have money. We had layers of global assets, shell corporations, and blind trusts designed for absolute privacy and tax efficiency, the kind of structure that only the ultra-wealthy use, and which only Daniel truly understood how to navigate. The world knew us simply as the owners of a medium-sized, successful tech consulting firm. What they didn't know was that Daniel had secretly sold that firm 5 years ago for a figure that started with a B. He'd always maintained that level of secrecy, especially about our home life. We lived modestly in the outskirts of San Francisco, in what Veronica later called the dilapidated bungalow, an unremarkable 1950s house on a large double-lot plot of land. To any casual observer, it was a valuable, aging property. To the tax authorities and the vultures of the financial world, it was just another house. But to us, that bungalow wasn't just dirt and wood. It was the keystone asset. Due to an archaic title loophole Daniel had exploited years ago, this specific piece of land held the physical deeds and legal linkage to the Master Trust Fund, a fund containing over $800 million. If I lost that bungalow before I could complete the complex, 3-step legal transfer process Daniel had laid out, a process that required his specialized legal contacts and deep knowledge of Maltese trusts, I would lose everything. Daniel had passed 2 weeks after his stroke, lucid for only a few hours. In those few hours, he had only time to whisper 3 things. The keystones. Stay quiet. Trust no one. I was left a vulnerable widow, suddenly having to master a billion-dollar legal labyrinth while navigating crippling grief. My true skill lay in business strategy, not convoluted trust law. I had the raw brainpower, but I lacked the time and the critical knowledge Daniel had taken with him. I was exposed. The clock was ticking. My son Elijah was the light of my life. A kind, brilliant architect, he was too decent for the cold, calculating world Daniel and I inhabited. He was blissfully unaware of the true depth of our wealth, believing we were simply comfortable middle class. He had fallen head over heels for Celeste during their graduate program. The first time I met Celeste I knew. Not because she was rude or loud, but because she was too smooth. She complimented my simple, well-worn clothes. She asked exactly the right questions about Elijah's potential, and his future earnings. She never asked about him, she asked about his trajectory. Then I met Veronica. The woman was a walking, breathing dollar sign, cloaked in designer fabrics and an air of superior judgment. Within 5 minutes of meeting her, she asked me, "So Alara, what did Daniel really leave behind for Elijah? Not the sentimentality, dear, the assets. Let's talk reality." That question was the moment the poor, naive mother persona was born. I knew then that the only way to protect the keystones and Elijah's future was to become utterly unthreatening. I became the widow struggling to keep the lights on, the poor soul who talked too much about her late husband's great potential instead of his actual achievements, and who apologized constantly for her lack of sophistication. Veronica's manipulation began in earnest almost immediately after Daniel's funeral. She saw my grief as an opportunity and my struggling small home as an easily obtainable target. "My poor sweet Alara," Veronica cooed, laying a perfectly manicured hand on my arm during the condolence dinner, a hand that felt like ice. "You look so terribly overwhelmed. This probate nonsense is a nightmare, isn't it? All those forms and lawyers. It's too much for a simple, sensitive soul like you." This was the opening volley of her pretend care. Veronica, who was actually a real estate mogul's wife and knew a dozen corporate lawyers, positioned herself as my selfless savior. "I insist that my personal attorney, Mr. Thompson, look over Daniel's will," she announced to Elijah, "just to make sure Alara isn't getting ripped off. We're family now. We protect each other." Elijah, relieved that someone was taking the burden off his grieving mother, thought this was the height of generosity. I played my role perfectly. "Oh, Veronica, you are so kind," I sniffled, dabbing my eyes with a crumpled tissue I'd pulled from my cheap purse. "I'm just so lost without Daniel managing everything." "Thompson. That sounds like a very expensive name. Can I afford him?" That sealed the deal. She loved the image of her swooping down to save the financially struggling widow. She installed Mr. Thompson, a lawyer who, predictably, reported every detail back to her, and started guiding the conversation toward the bungalow. "Thompson says the house is a mess, Alara. Great location, but the title is messy and the repairs are endless," she'd tell me over weekly support lunches. "It's an emotional anchor weighing you down. Why don't you sign it over to Elijah and Celeste? They can use their wedding funds to renovate it, giving you a quiet, rent-free little apartment in return. It gets the asset out of your name, simplifies the inheritance, and frees you." Asset out of my name. That was the key phrase. She didn't want the house to be sold. She wanted the title transferred immediately. She wanted the keystones. The climax of their entitlement came during a formal engagement party planning meeting at Veronica's palatial home. The discussion had turned to the prenuptial agreement, which I, as the poor mother, had meekly insisted upon, a small nod to the wealth Elijah did have, which was still substantial. Veronica scoffed. "Alara, darling, you need to understand how these things work. You worry about the little things, the flower arrangements perhaps, and let the adults handle the legalities." I pushed back gently, maintaining my persona of confused but concerned motherhood. "But the prenup, it just seems a little unfair to Elijah. I mean, what if they were to divorce? He'd have nothing left of his father's estate." Veronica's gaze hardened into pure contempt. She stopped pretending to be kind. "Let me be frank, Alara," she said, setting down her crystal glass with a sharp clink. "We all know you were just Daniel's sweet little homemaker. You didn't build the empire. You just polished the furniture. The reason you're so overwhelmed now is because you don't actually understand how money or law works. You're disposable in this equation. Now sign the documents Thompson sent over, and let Celeste and I focus on the wedding budget. That, at least, is something you won't ruin." The insult wasn't just about my current situation. It was a total dismissal of my entire life, my intelligence, and the success I had quietly created alongside Daniel. She thought I was disposable. I just stared at the marble countertop, my eyes welling up with tears. Perfectly crafted, convincing tears of helplessness and hurt. I let the sting of her words fuel the fire inside. "I understand," I whispered, picking up the pen. "I just want my son to be happy." As I signed the minor, innocuous document she'd pushed toward me, not the deed, not yet, just a retainer for Thompson, I knew two things for certain. They were driven by pure, unadulterated greed, and the facade of the poor, naive mother was the most powerful weapon I had. I needed to let them dig their hole deeper. My vulnerability was their greatest confidence. The next step was inevitable. Veronica, sensing my surrender, moved swiftly from manipulative suggestion to concrete action. She wasn't going to wait for the wedding. She was going to seize the asset before the transfer window closed. The insult at the engagement planning was Veronica's last subtle move. Once she determined I was intellectually and financially disposable, she stopped wasting time on pretense. 2 weeks later, the escalation began with a cold, impersonal packet of papers delivered by a private courier. The documents were a petition for judicial oversight and appointment of a conservator. The petitioner? Celeste and Elijah. The proposed conservator? Veronica herself. The paperwork, meticulously crafted by Mr. Thompson, argued that following Daniel's sudden death, my profound and debilitating grief had rendered me temporarily incapable of managing the complexities of the estate. It cited my confessed anxiety about money, my reluctance to use Thompson's services, and most damningly, a minor, easily reparable leak in the bungalow's roof, proof, they argued, that I was neglecting the assets. The goal was transparent. If the court appointed Veronica as conservator, she would gain immediate, undisputed control over the bungalow's title, allowing her to complete the transfer and effectively lock me out before Daniel's 6-month transfer window for the Keystone asset closed. It was a brilliant, predatory move. They weren't trying to steal the house. They were trying to steal my control over the house by weaponizing my vulnerability and my grief. When Elijah came home that evening, he was distraught, having been blindsided by his own signature on the petition, which Veronica had deceptively woven into the initial documents I had signed in Act 2. "Mom, I'm so sorry, I signed a stack of things Veronica said were related to the prenup. She said it was just simplifying the estate because you were so stressed." I told her to stop immediately, but she just said she was doing it for my future, and that you couldn't handle the pressure. I placed a comforting hand on his cheek, feeling a deep protective love for my sweet, oblivious son. "It's all right, Elijah. I know you didn't mean any harm. I'll call Mr. Thompson tomorrow and tell him I'm feeling much better. I'll tell him I'm withdrawing the petition." I played the role of the recovering widow, asserting with manufactured fragility that I was now strong enough to handle my own affairs. This, however, was part of the trap. Veronica was expecting me to fight Thompson and get the court involved. A slow public process that would drain my energy and open my true finances to scrutiny. I had to let them think they were still winning, even after I withdrew the petition. I filed a polite, formal withdrawal of the petition, citing a sudden burst of energy and a sense of duty to my late husband. Veronica, furious at the delay, immediately shifted tactics. If she couldn't take control through the courts, she would force the sale through Elijah. Veronica scheduled an emergency meeting with Elijah and me at her opulent estate, insisting we discuss a viable, permanent solution for my housing. She needed the bungalow and she needed it now. During the meeting, I maintained my air of confusion, asking repetitive questions about escrow and capital gains. I accidentally, on purpose, spilled a small amount of tea on my dress, the cheap polyester one I wore specifically for these occasions. "Oh, I am so sorry, Veronica. How clumsy of me. I'm just so frazzled," I wailed, reaching for the paper napkin. Veronica, utterly disgusted, waved a dismissive hand. "Go use the powder room, Alara. Down the hall, first door on the left. Don't touch anything." This was my window. I didn't go to the powder room. I walked instead to the massive custom-built oak desk in the library, where Veronica had been on a business call just moments before our meeting started. I knew she was arrogant and I knew she was lazy. Her laptop was sitting open, glowing faintly. She hadn't even locked the screen. I moved with the silent, practiced speed of a former corporate strategist who once orchestrated multi-million-dollar acquisitions, while simultaneously making sure my son had his homework ready. My fingers flew across the trackpad, navigating her open email application. The key was not the latest email, but a forwarded chain with Mr. Thompson, dated 2 days prior. The subject line "The Cypress Property Alara's Bungalow. Tax Mitigation Window." I scanned the brief exchange. Veronica wasn't talking about the small house. She was talking about something far more valuable. Veronica to Thompson. "Is the 1031 exchange window still open?" Confirm the original title date allows for the generational asset swap. If we can fold the Cyprus title into the offshore Cayman holding before the wedding, we not only lock out Alara, but we mitigate 70% of the capital gains on the new high-rise purchase next month. Thompson's reply confirmed. The Cyprus Properties Bizarre 1957 double-lot split title is the perfect clean wedge to leverage the tax law. It's not about the $2 million property value, Veronica. It's the mechanism. Once we have the deed, it's a $20 million tax shielding mechanism. She hasn't figured out why Daniel kept the old title structure, so she won't fight the transfer. It's the mechanism. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind was ice cold. They didn't know about the $800 million trust, but they knew about the property's value as a rare, time-sensitive tax loophole. They were using my son's marriage, not just to steal an asset, but to commit massive corporate tax fraud that would net them $20 million and potentially drag Elijah into legal trouble later. The bungalow was not just the key to my secret trust. It was the key to their illegal fortune. The stakes had just become interstellar. They weren't just greedy, they were criminal. I silently took my phone, pulled up the camera, and snapped 5 rapid-fire pictures of the email chain, including the full headers and timestamps. I then walked casually out of the library, the naive, apologetic mother once more, dabbing her wet dress. My, that was a close call. I chirped as I rejoined them, my voice trembling with the perfect amount of nervousness. Veronica looked at me with open impatience. Right. Now back to the deed. Elijah, darling, tell your mother that signing the quitclaim deed is the most reasonable thing to do before the wedding. It simplifies everything. I nodded slowly, looking down at my hands. Yes, I suppose I should. I just need a few days to think about Daniel's old papers. He always kept things so meticulously organized. I'm such a mess. They had just made their fatal mistake. They had told me they were focused on the deed transfer, giving me the precise deadline I needed. Before the wedding, 3 weeks away. They had no idea I had just acquired the blueprint to their entire operation. The moment I was alone in my dilapidated bungalow, the act ended. The polyester dress came off, and the gloves came off with it. The trembling hands were replaced by the steady hands of Alara Vance, the silent business genius who had always been the strategic backbone of Daniel's empire. I went straight to Daniel's private, concealed office, which he had designed to look like a storage closet. I powered up the encrypted terminal. My task was clear. I had 3 weeks to complete a 6-month legal process and neutralize a multi-million-dollar tax evasion scheme simultaneously. My first call went to a number Daniel had scribbled on a napkin before his stroke. Yuri Trust 733. Yuri. I spoke clearly, my voice devoid of the shaky vulnerability of the past few months. My name is Alara Vance. I'm calling on behalf of Daniel. The keystones are compromised. I need to initiate the emergency transfer protocol for Trust 733, effective immediately. And I need a full legal audit of the Cyprus Properties title history, specifically focusing on any recent inquiries from a firm named Thompson and Associates. Yuri, who had clearly been expecting this call for months, simply replied, "The window is tight, Alara. But the assets are protected by the Trust's constitution. I will be on the next flight. In the meantime, you need to prepare the evidence for the second operation." The second operation was the crucial element, setting the trap for Veronica and Celeste, ensuring their greed would not just be foiled, but exposed and penalized. I needed the legal transfer to happen before the wedding, but I needed the reveal to happen at the wedding. I spent the next 3 weeks working 15-hour days, often on the floor of Daniel's closet office, fueled by coffee and vengeance. Yuri arrived and worked silently in the study, navigating the international legal complexities. I meanwhile focused on the local trap. I obtained a specific legal document, an obscure clause Daniel had written into the original property title in 1999, an agreement known as the Contingent Interest Clause. It was the secret weapon that turned the Keystone asset from a passive treasure into an active bomb. I didn't tell Elijah any of this. I simply smiled, told him I was feeling much better, and that I had decided to accept the transfer request. I would sign the deed, not just to let Veronica and Celeste believe they had won, but to put the property exactly where I needed it to be for the final, devastating act of the plan. The day of the prenuptial document signing arrived, 3 days before the wedding. I was ready to play my final scene as the defeated widow. The wedding was tomorrow, and the legal showdown was today. The stage was set for Veronica's ultimate victory, and her most catastrophic failure. The scene of my surrender was the sterile wooden glass conference room at Thompson & Associates, the law firm working for the very woman who was stealing my family's legacy. The air conditioning was set to a glacial temperature, mirroring the atmosphere. Present were Mr. Thompson, a slick, pale man whose eyes only saw dollar signs, Celeste, looking chic and bored in a cream suit, and Veronica, who arrived last, sweeping in like a corporate queen surveying her newly conquered territory. Elijah sat beside me, his brow furrowed with a mixture of discomfort and obligation. He still genuinely believed this was an act of simplifying Mom's life. I was back in my costume, the faded blue dress, the cheap handbag, and the apologetic demeanor. "Right," Veronica announced, not even bothering to sit down before motioning toward the documents spread on the enormous table. "Alara dear, let's get this finalized. Mr. Thompson has prepared the quitclaim deed for the Cypress property. You simply sign it over, and the house is officially transferred to Elijah and Celeste's premarital holding company. This is the simplest, cleanest way to avoid probate complications down the line, as we discussed." Mr. Thompson slid the papers toward me. I picked up the pen, my hand shaking visibly. A mix of genuine adrenaline and performance. I just want to be sure," I stammered, looking at Elijah, then back at Veronica. It's the last thing Daniel and I own together. It feels so final." Celeste sighed dramatically, checking the face of her designer watch. "Mom, we're not throwing you out on the street. It's an investment. We'll build you that nice little granny flat on the lot line, rent-free forever. You'll be right there." Veronica leaned in, her voice lowering just enough to sound conspiratorial, though the cruelty remained. "Look, Alara, stop being melodramatic. Your sentimentality is charming, but it's delaying a very important financial maneuver. Daniel, bless his soul, was a brilliant man, but he was also terribly disorganized about his personal assets. This property is a huge tax burden if it stays in your name, tied up in the estate. We are liberating you from the paperwork. You see, Alara," Mr. Thompson interjected, adjusting his tie, "the structure of the transfer is designed to maximize the generational asset swap before the end-of-quarter reporting deadline. By putting the property into the LLC today, we can immediately begin the process of leveraging its unique title structure for the 1031 exchange that Veronica is executing." He was giving away the plot in legal jargon, confident that the poor, naive woman wouldn't understand. I nodded blankly, playing the fool. "Oh, tax stuff," I mumbled. "That sounds terribly complicated. I wouldn't understand any of that." Veronica smirked at Celeste, a silent confirmation that their assessment of me was correct. "Exactly," Veronica said, her voice rising with arrogant confidence. She was tasting victory. "This is why you leave this to the professionals, Alara. This entire process, the wedding, the transfer, the new high-rise purchase, it's all a delicate financial chain reaction. Your husband made a mess with all his convoluted clauses and outdated deeds, but we're cleaning it up. We're turning that little headache of a bungalow into a multi-million-dollar tax shield. And we are doing it for Elijah's future." She placed her hand on the deed I was about to sign. "Sign it, Alara. Let us take care of you, just as Daniel would have wanted." I picked up the pen again. I looked at the signatures. Elijah's signed blindly. Thompson's witnessed. And now mine. With a flourish, I signed the name Alara Vance onto the quitclaim deed. The moment the pen left the paper, a cold, empty feeling washed over me. A feeling that was more real than any of my performance. I had just signed away the physical key to Daniel's legacy, the one tangible piece of our life together that held the $800 million trust fund. Even though Yuri had initiated the emergency transfer on the back end, the loss of the physical property, the literal ground we stood on, felt like a true betrayal of Daniel's memory. I slumped back in my chair, allowing my shoulders to droop. My chin wobbled. I didn't need to fake the grief now. I felt the profound cost of the past 7 months. The stress, the sleepless nights, the humiliation of being consistently dismissed and insulted. I had sacrificed my pride and handed them the weapon they wanted, all for the sake of the greater, hidden war. Is that it? I whispered, my voice thick with genuine emotion. That's it, Veronica said, snatching the deed with the speed of a predator. She didn't spare me a glance. Her attention was already on Thompson. Get this recorded immediately, Thompson. I want the transfer locked in by end of business today. This cannot be delayed. Elijah, seeing my genuine distress, put his arm around me. Mom, it's okay. I promise we'll make sure you're happy. This is just paperwork. He didn't understand that to me it wasn't paperwork. It was Daniel's secret, and I had just given it to the wolves. For a fleeting second, the despair was overwhelming. What if Yuri hadn't moved fast enough? What if the transfer failed? I was operating on Daniel's whispered instructions and my own razor-thin plan. If this failed, I wouldn't just be poor. I would be destitute and legally complicit in a major tax fraud scheme. Veronica, however, mistook my devastation for complete defeat. She looked at me with open, triumphant pity. Good, Alara. Now pull yourself together. You look like you've been crying in the kitchen again, she scoffed, gesturing to the tear tracks I deliberately left. We have a rehearsal dinner tomorrow. Try to look presentable. Satisfied that the deed was secured, Veronica turned her attention to Mr. Thompson, already planning the next step of her multi-million-dollar tax scheme. This was the moment her arrogance peaked, and the essential details of her scheme were discussed in front of the disposable old woman. Now, Thompson, that title is the key, Veronica commanded, tapping the signed deed. That antique 1957 double-lot title is what allows us to qualify for the generational swap. I need absolute assurance that the asset is pure. I need zero encumbrances. Thompson flipped through a binder, pausing at a section marked Property History. Indeed, Veronica. The original 1957 deed, which Mr. Vance utilized, contained a highly unusual and convoluted series of riders and caveats, a remnant of an old land lease agreement, really. It was totally pointless for its current residential use, Thompson explained, giving a professional, dismissive smile. He looked directly at me, the widow, to underscore his mastery over my dead husband's affairs. However, as a condition of this quitclaim deed, we have executed a separate, irrevocable affidavit asserting that the property is conveyed as a clean, unencumbered, residential asset with no existing or pending covenants, clauses, or contingent interests that could impair its value as a tax mechanism. Thompson then tapped the second page of the deed, which I had just signed. See here, Alara? By signing the transfer, you implicitly acknowledge and consent to this affidavit. You agree that the title is clean, and that Daniel's antiquated additions are null and void. This is the only way the LLC will accept the title. Veronica nodded sharply. Perfect. Clean. Unencumbered. That's what the IRS requires for the 1031. Daniel's bizarre choices are finally irrelevant. She had done it. Veronica had just made the fatal mistake that I had indeed signed the quitclaim deed, transferring the property. But the irrevocable affidavit, asserting a clean, unencumbered residential asset, was a specific, separate legal document. Daniel's contingent interest clause, my secret weapon, was not an outdated rider. It was a non-severable component of the original 1957 parent document, requiring a separate, explicit waiver of contingent interest signed by the beneficiary to be removed that I knew Daniel. He had built that clause, which stipulated the property could only be used for the original purpose of affordable family housing, specifically to make the asset unsuitable for high-level corporate tax evasion. Veronica and Thompson, in their rush and arrogance to create a clean asset for their $20 million scheme, had assumed that my signature on the quitclaim deed implicitly covered everything. They had proudly proclaimed in front of two witnesses, Elijah and Celeste, that the property was clean and free of contingent interests, when they had failed to acquire the only document that truly cleaned the title, my explicit waiver. They had transferred the property, yes, but the property they had acquired still carried a fatal, hidden poison pill, a clause that made it completely useless for a 1031 exchange, and a clause that they had just publicly and legally stated didn't exist. The revenge plan was now set in concrete. They had taken the bait, and they had just guaranteed their own undoing. I nodded again, tears welling up in my eyes, but this time the tears were purely from the anticipation of the carnage to come. That sounds much simpler. Thank you for sorting out Daniel's messes. As they gathered their papers triumphantly, I knew exactly when and where the final reveal would occur. Not in a law office but at the place they valued most, their opulent public celebration. The day of the wedding arrived. The ballroom was draped in silk, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and unchecked ego. The final act was about to begin. The wedding reception was everything Veronica had always aspired to be. Excessively formal, dripping in unearned luxury, and filled with guests who looked at me, the mother of the groom, with barely concealed pity. I wore a simple black dress, one I had bought years ago, perfectly tailored but deliberately plain. I looked like an honored guest, not the woman holding the fate of two families in her hands. The moment arrived during the toast segment. Elijah, sweet and beaming, raised his glass to his new bride. Celeste, radiant but with an air of cold calculation, returned the smile. Then Veronica, the matriarch, took the microphone, her voice booming with self-importance. To Celeste and Elijah, may their future be as bright and stable as the real estate portfolio they now share, she declared, her eyes flickering toward me, the former owner of the Keystone property, a triumphant dig at my supposed inability to manage assets. And to the wisdom of simplifying complicated estates, allowing true prosperity to flourish. As she set the mic down, I knew this was my only chance. My trembling hands were steady now. The naive mother was gone, replaced by Alara Vance, the strategist. I walked calmly to the stage, picked up the microphone and tapped it lightly. The room fell silent. Veronica looked furious, her face contorting in a silent command for me to sit down. Celeste just looked confused. Elijah looked supportive but worried. "Thank you, Veronica," I said, my voice resonating clearly through the ballroom speakers, stripped of its apologetic tremor. A beautiful sentiment. But I must correct one crucial detail. I paused, letting the silence stretch. I didn't cry or shout. I just delivered the truth, cold and precise. Yesterday, I signed the quitclaim deed for the Cyprus property, the bungalow my husband Daniel and I built our lives in. I did this on the condition, and with the legal assertion from Mr. Thompson and Veronica herself, that the title was clean, unencumbered, and free of any contingent interests. I pulled a crisp, yellowing document from my plain black handbag. The contingent interest clause Daniel had slipped into the parent deed decades ago. When Veronica and Mr. Thompson claimed that the title was clean, they were relying on my presumed incompetence. They assumed Daniel's clauses were antiquated and irrelevant. They assumed I was merely a disposable homemaker, who didn't understand the difference between a rider and a covenant. They were naturally wrong. I looked directly at Veronica, who was now halfway across the room, rushing toward the stage, her face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The quitclaim deed you hold transfers the physical property, yes. But the property you acquired is legally poisoned, I continued, raising the document. The 1957 parent deed contains an absolute and non-severable contingent interest clause stipulating that if the property is ever used for corporate financial maneuvering, specifically any form of tax mitigation such as a 1031 exchange, which Mr. Thompson so helpfully named as your intention, the title immediately becomes voidable and subject to reversion to the original purpose of affordable family housing. The room, filled with Veronica's wealthy business associates, gasped. They understood the legal severity instantly. A voidable title in a complex exchange is catastrophic. Furthermore, I added, holding up the second page of yesterday's deed, in your rush, you failed to obtain the only legal document that could nullify that clause, the waiver of contingent interest, which, according to Daniel's original filing, could only be signed by me, the immediate beneficiary, and only in the presence of a specific government-appointed arbiter. Yesterday you asserted, on the record, that this contingent interest did not exist. By executing the quitclaim transfer without this waiver, and in declaring the asset clean, you have not only invalidated the entire 1031 exchange, but have committed a massive, documented act of title misrepresentation and corporate fraud. I looked over Veronica's head toward the ballroom doors. Which brings me to my first witness. The ballroom doors swung open. Two figures entered. One was Yuri, the impeccably dressed, ice-eyed Maltese attorney. The other was an official from the State Tax Enforcement Division. Veronica stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. She recognized Yuri instantly. Daniel had once beaten her husband in a major acquisition battle precisely because of Yuri's legal structure. Thompson, who had been discreetly watching from the back, dropped his phone and began backing toward a service door. Yuri is here to confirm 2 things, I announced. First, the contingent interest clause is valid, non-severable, and the property you stole is now worthless to your tax scheme. Second, the transfer of this encumbered property triggered Daniel's far greater asset. This was the final brutal twist. I looked at Veronica, whose expensive gown suddenly looked cheap against the backdrop of her crumbling composure. You thought I was poor, Veronica. You assumed Daniel's entire estate was tied up in that bungalow. You insulted me and called me disposable because you saw me as financially insignificant. You believed I didn't know how money works. I gave her a devastating slow smile, the first genuine smile of the past 7 months. My husband Daniel and I didn't just own a consulting firm. We owned an $800 million global trust fund designed for generational privacy. The bungalow, the keystone asset you worked so hard to steal, was merely the physical lock on that trust. The moment the title was transferred without the explicit waiver of contingent interest, it triggered an automatic irrevocable transfer of the entire $800 million fund to the beneficiary who retained the moral high ground and protected Daniel's intent. I used your greed to clean my own hands and activate my true wealth. The noise in the room was deafening. Guests, the people Veronica spent her life impressing, started whispering, pointing, and reaching for their own phones. Veronica's face was a masterpiece of pure, distilled agony. First, financial ruin. Second, the humiliation of being exposed as a small-time failed crook in front of her entire social circle. She let out a choked sound, a mix of rage and despair. She lunged toward me, her hands outstretched. You lying ***. Before she could reach the stage, Yuri and the state tax official had smoothly intercepted her. Celeste, witnessing her entire future collapse, didn't scream or cry. She turned to Elijah, her eyes wide with terror, not for him but for her loss. Elijah, she hissed, her voice trembling. Did you know about the trust? Are you getting any of that? Elijah, heartbroken by the entire ugly scene and the realization that his mother was a strategic mastermind, just shook his head. I didn't know anything. But I know you only asked about the house and the assets, Celeste. Never about her. Celeste's face dissolved into tears of pure financial devastation. She didn't mourn the loss of the marriage. She mourned the loss of the fortune. She turned and fled the reception in her wedding gown, leaving her new husband standing utterly alone. I calmly stepped off the stage, handing the original contingent interest clause to the tax official. The consequences were swift, brutal, and public. 1. The 1031 exchange collapse. Because Veronica and Thompson had officially filed an affidavit asserting a clean title for an asset that was demonstrably not clean, the entire $20 million tax mitigation scheme collapsed. Veronica's corporation was now on the hook for massive capital gains taxes and severe penalties for misrepresentation. 2. Thompson's ruin. Mr. Thompson, having failed to secure the necessary waiver due to arrogance, was immediately exposed to malpractice suits, loss of licensure, and lawsuits from Veronica's now furious partners. He was last seen being escorted out of the building. 3. The property reversion. The bungalow, the keystone asset, reverted to the original intent under the contingent interest clause. It became an affordable housing nonprofit managed by Daniel's estate, now fully controlled by me. It was stripped of its value as a leverage tool and turned into the moral asset Daniel always intended. For Celeste's loss, Celeste had married a man who still had a respectable income, but who was now legally entwined in a corporate tax investigation initiated by his mother-in-law. Her prenuptial agreement, which she had demanded, ensured she walked away with nothing but a ruined wedding dress and a shattered reputation. As the wedding reception dissolved into a chaotic mix of financial disaster and scandal, I walked over to Elijah. He looked pale, but his expression was one of profound understanding. Mom, he said, his voice raw. You did all this to protect the integrity of Dad's wishes, and to save me from them. I let her have the house, Elijah, I said quietly. But I saved you from her poison. That was the only thing that ever mattered. The reversal was complete. The poor, naive mother had just cost the greedy social climber everything she held dear, securing the family legacy and ensuring my son's moral freedom in one clean, devastating maneuver. The storm had passed, leaving behind clarity and a stunning, unimaginable peace. The immediate aftermath was quiet, dignified, and utterly freeing. The $800 million trust, now fully under my control, was not a source of extravagance but a shield of independence. I didn't need mansions or private jets. I needed space, peace, and the freedom to honor Daniel's memory. My first act was to take a simple, solitary trip, not to some exotic resort, but back to the small coastal town where Daniel and I had first met, long before the businesses and the wealth. I rented a quiet cottage overlooking the ocean, where the only sounds were the gulls and the waves. I finally allowed myself to grieve Daniel without the added burden of performance or deceit. I was Alara Vance again, not the naive widow. The Keystone Bungalow, now managed by the newly formed Vance Family Foundation, was refurbished and dedicated to providing low-cost, dignified housing for single-parent families, exactly what Daniel had intended with his obscure legal clauses. It became a living monument to his values, not a tool for corporate greed. Elijah and I spoke frequently. He was crushed by the end of his relationship with Celeste, but ultimately relieved to be free of Veronica's suffocating, materialistic expectations. He began an independent life, taking a sabbatical to volunteer and rediscover himself, finally understanding that true security wasn't in wealth, but in integrity. He thanked me endlessly, not for the money, but for saving his soul from the toxicity of their ambition. I had given him the priceless gift of a fresh start. My new home became a small sun-drenched penthouse in a city far from Veronica's influence. It was beautifully furnished, but functional and quiet. I spent my days managing the foundation's grants, reading, and simply enjoying the silence that had been absent for too long. My life was finally my own, funded by a trust that was now safe, secured by my own calculated courage. I never saw Veronica again in person, but one of my former business associates, who delighted in gossip, sent me a clipping months later. Veronica's company was facing multiple legal challenges. The IRS penalties had crippled her assets, and the collapse of the 1031 exchange had triggered margin calls on her leveraged real estate holdings. Thompson and Associates was bankrupt. Her husband had quietly filed for divorce, citing the massive financial liability she had created. The image in the article was of Veronica walking out of a smaller, less prestigious courthouse. She wasn't wearing couture. She was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. Her face, once a mask of sculpted arrogance, was drawn tight with hatred and bitter regret. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at the ground, utterly disgraced. The regret was palpable. She hadn't just lost $20 million. She had lost her entire identity and status because she was too arrogant to believe that a quiet woman in a simple dress could be smarter than her entire legal team. Her final punishment wasn't financial. It was the realization that the poor and naive mother had beaten her at her own ruthless game, exposing her as the truly disposable one. I took a deep breath, looked out over my city, and smiled. Never mistake kindness for weakness, or a quiet mind for an empty one. The most powerful forces are often the ones you cannot see. If this story spoke to you, please subscribe to this channel. There's more silence that bites back.